What is up, guys, and welcome back to Above the Middle, the place where we talk about all things personal development with me, Joe Gibson. This week we are talking about men. We're talking about why in the 21st century men still find it incredibly difficult to talk about their emotions, to talk about and acknowledge their own internal struggles. And this is coming from personal experience. I found it so difficult for so long to talk about the things that were bothering me. And I can wholeheartedly say that not talking about your emotions, that choosing to suppress the things that are bothering you, ultimately lead to so much more harm down the line. That is what we are talking about today, guys. So without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Why do men find it so difficult to talk about their emotions? Why do we find it so difficult to acknowledge that we have our own struggles, that we have things that are bothering us? Why do we choose to distract ourselves and choose to ignore reality and ultimately cause ourselves more harm down the line? Well, if we think about it, we are coming off generations of gender roles whereby men were told that emotions had no place, that our role was to work, our role was to provide, and that there was no room for emotions, that emotions equaled weakness. And I can say from personal experience that the only thing that made me weak over several years of suppression was choosing to ignore my emotions. I've become so much stronger from actually acknowledging that I have them and talking about them. And if we think about where the world was 100 years ago, we were in the midst of 2 world wars. Men were sent to kill. Men were sent into the battlefield. There probably wasn't much room for emotion. I can imagine that having emotion during that time would have been extremely detrimental to their health. So we have historic reasons that still do show up in our day-to-day lives now. You know, we're coming off the back of our parents, our grandparents, having these ideologies that were passed on to us. We also live in a world that kind of favours masculine energy. Our workplace is still very masculine. There isn't much room for emotion in the workplace. Why it is still very much go into work, do your job. We have to remember in school as well, I don't remember ever being taught about emotional intelligence, which is crazy when you think about it. We're taught the things that we need to get from A to B. But then when you reach adulthood and you leave university and you graduate, you're kind of left with yourself and you're like, how do I actually deal with me? I have all these emotions, I have all these issues, and I have no sort of capacity to actually deal with them. I've never been taught this is a healthy emotion, that this is an unhealthy emotion, that in order to get past my problems, I need to feel them. And mental health is still very much stigmatized as well. People assume that if you're going to a therapist that you must be crazy, when actually going to a therapist is probably the best thing you can do for your mental health. And we treat mental health like it's some psychotic kind of thing. People still have that kind of stigma, maybe not strongly, but it's definitely still there. And that on top of generations of telling men that they can't feel their emotions just breeds this inability to deal with them. And if we think about the amount of distractions we have as well, it's so easy to just ignore the reality of your situation and just engross yourself in external things. If I don't want to feel my emotions, I can go get drunk. If I don't want to feel my emotions, I can sit and watch Netflix all day. If I don't want to feel my emotions, I can engross myself in a relationship. I can pull myself outwards from myself and distract myself in 1,000,001 ways. So those are just a few reasons there, and we have to stop it. We have to realise that feeling your emotions is completely healthy. That it doesn't make you less of a man to have issues. We all have fucking issues. We all have things that are bothering us. It is a much more adult thing to do now, to talk about the things that are bothering you. Because ultimately, all you're doing is hurting yourself by choosing to suppress. And I did that to myself for years. I just ignored the reality of my situation. I chose not to think about the things that were bothering me because I was afraid of what people might think. I was afraid of what I might think. I was afraid it would make me less of a man if I was to talk about the things that are bothering me. I could go on all day about reasons why men in the 21st century can't feel their emotions. But ultimately, what we have to understand is that suppressing our emotions is the worst thing we can do for our mental health. There's a reason why the men's suicide rate is so high, and it's primarily down to our inability to talk about our emotions, to talk about the things that are bothering us. So let's go into why suppression is ultimately the worst thing you can do for your mental health. Why we must choose to feel our emotions as they come up, to hold space for the things that are bothering us, and why we must not suppress them. So ultimately, suppression of emotions comes down to fear. It's the fear of not being able to deal with the emotions when they come up. It's the fear of being judged for having issues. And what we have to learn, and this comes back to anxiety and all that sort of thing, when we choose to avoid something, it's only going to get worse, because anxiety feeds on avoidance. So if you are scared of feeling something, if you are scared of talking about an issue, if you choose to distract yourself and avoid yourself, all you're going to be doing then is just intensifying that anxiety, so that when it does eventually come up, it's going to be 1,000,000 times worse. We have to remember that when we choose to suppress our emotions, we are basically telling ourselves that we aren't worthy of having them, that there is no room for them, or we're telling ourselves that we're not capable of feeling them. And all you're doing through that process is lowering your capacity to deal with them, because you're telling yourself that you can't. So if you're hiding your issues suppressing your issues for months or years, all you're doing through that time is subconsciously telling yourself that you can't deal with them. So when it does eventually blow up, which it ultimately does, it's going to be so much worse because you've reduced your capacity to deal with them. And here's the reality with the situation of suppression as well. You could be going about your days completely fine, living a completely happy life, but they are still there. I spent much of my university life ignoring some deep issues that I had, and they never went away. You know, I look back and yeah, I was happy. I was doing things that made me feel good. I was having a good time. There was always that little voice in my head telling me that something was wrong. And it would come out when life got stressful. If, you know, I was being rejected by somebody, if something was quite difficult in my life at the time and I'd get upset, like the floodgates would open. All these issues I was holding in the back of my head would just come to the surface. And my experiences in those moments were so much worse. What I ultimately chose to do was pick myself up and be like, okay, I'm fine now. Forget about that. Put it to the back of my head. And I'd keep suppressing and I'd keep ignoring. And I keep distracting myself and drinking too much and doing all that sort of stuff to try and cover up the fact that I had issues. I was so afraid of my inability to deal with them that I couldn't deal with them. But what I realised now, that in suppressing those things, I was just reducing my capacity to deal with it. And then over years, when things finally came to a head, life went to shit. Because I'd spent so long saying, I can't deal with this, I can't deal with this, that when it ultimately did come out, it just blew up. And I was so much more worse off than if I had just faced my issues in the first place. You know, you can imagine you're locking your issues behind a door and you're holding that door shut. There's always going to be that knock that the issue is still there. The fire behind the door is just going to grow until it can't contain itself anymore. There'll be a time in your life like mine where I did not have the choice to face my issues anymore. There was no choice. My issues got so big that it just blew up in my face and I was forced to face them. And that can be a great thing. We do want to face our issues eventually. But I feel like this is the reason why so many men, you know, end up committing suicide. Because they spent so long reducing their capacity to deal with their issues that when they do finally blow up, they can't deal with it. They choose to kill themselves instead of actually facing their issues. And you know, that's pretty deep, but it's the reality of the situation. You have to realise that suppressing your emotions ultimately leads to so much harm to yourself. And you know, you might be thinking to yourself, well, my life is going kind of okay now. I don't want to bring that issue to the surface and talk about it because it's going to kind of rock the boat. Things are going to get difficult for a while. But we have to realise that rocking the boat now is actually a much better option than waiting for a tsunami to come in a year or two and knock you for six. That is what we have to realise. And there's so much support available for you. You have to realise that you can go to therapy, speak to a friend, speak to a family member, people that you trust. The people who care about you truly will hold space for that. Don't fear that because you are a man that you can't speak about your problems, because that is bullshit. For me, becoming an adult was actually realising that actually speaking about your emotions is actually a really healthy thing to do. That actually makes you more of a man to talk about these sort of stuff. We have to realise that, guys, and I can tell you the things that bothered me were fucking massive. They were real issues to me. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it and say just deal with your issues, it's completely fine, because my issues were fucking frightening to me. Like, I was so afraid of feeling the stuff which I was thinking about that I avoided it. But if I had spent the time, had the knowledge to actually do so when it came up early on, I would have had a much better time, I imagine, than waiting for it to blow up in my face. So just do yourself a favour and just simply truly acknowledge that there is a problem there. You know, I find writing about stuff so powerful because we can have stuff bouncing around our head all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are acknowledging it. I remember there was one time I was walking down the street and there were kind of like these anxieties in the back of my head that were worrying me, and I chosen to ignore them for ages. And then one day I was just like, I'm not doing this anymore. Even though I'm thinking about it, it's not really bringing anything to the surface. So I chose to sit down with my journal one day and just write about the things that were bothering me. And that process of just taking thought into the outside world, into paper, was so cathartic, I can't even explain. I felt so much better even after just writing it. You know, when we are bottling the stuff inside our head, when we are choosing not to bring it to the surface, it's just going to show up in other ways. If we think about depression for a second, depression is kind of like a result of suppressing negative emotions. If you feel sadness in your life, if you feel dissatisfaction in your life and you're choosing to ignore it, you're suppressing that stuff into your unconscious. It might feel like you're ignoring it, but what's going to come out of it is depression. You're going to sit down at the end of the day and wonder, why do I feel so low? It feels like there's something missing. It feels like there's a hole that I can't fill and I don't know why. It's because you're ignoring the reality of the situation, because there are things in your life that are dissatisfying you and you're not facing it. So it's coming out as this just negative energy, which comes out as depression. That's why just acknowledging the fact that you have depression in the first place, or that you are feeling dissatisfied in your life, is the first step to curing depression. It's just truly acknowledging, I feel kind of dissatisfied in my life right now. You start bringing stuff to the surface. It affects your mental health, it'll affect your physical health. Just imagine, if you aren't bringing that energy outwards, you've got all that emotional energy just sat inside you, even if you don't realise it, that's going to be using up resources that could be used for other things. And so your immune system is going to be working on overdrive to kind of hide that shit and not focus on, battling illnesses. So really there's a whole load of implications that can come from suppressing our emotions, but ultimately it'll really affect your mental health. When that stuff eventually blows up, it's going to be so much harder to deal with. And that's just the message I wanted to send home today. That it's completely fine to feel your emotions, even if you are a man. That is not a weakness. Thank you so much guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video. Check out the blog where I talk about this stuff in a little bit more detail. Click that subscribe button and I'll see you next week. Thank you so much. See ya.